A K9 warrior lay crushed beneath a massive granite slab, her broken body a frozen shield over 3 fading heartbeats. She was trained to never surrender, but in the heart of a killing blizzard, she was just a mother waiting to die. But a ghost found her. A broken SWAT sniper hiding from the world looked into her amber eyes and saw not a stray, but a fellow soldier. To save her, he didn't just brave the storm. He turned his sanctuary into a war zone and stood alone against 50 heavily armed mercenaries. No one believed a man and a crippled dog could hold the line against an army. But loyalty is stronger than any armor. What this 3-legged hero did when the bullets started flying will make you weep and believe that sometimes the savior you need is the one you just saved. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe that no soldier gets left behind, human or K9, hit that subscribe button because this story might just restore your faith in true courage. The wind shrieked against the rotting timber of the mountain cabin, turning the Bitterroot wilderness into a white, suffocating tomb where the boundary between earth and sky had been erased. Inside the dilapidated structure, Ethan Vance sat in the encroaching darkness, a silhouette carved from patience and granite, waiting for a ghost that might never arrive. He was a man who wore silence like a second skin, his 34-year-old face etched with the kind of hardness that didn't come from age, but from seeing too much of the world's ugly underbelly. A jagged scar ran through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a raid in Detroit that had gone sideways, bisecting a gaze that was usually as cold and gray as the storm outside. Ethan was a Tier 1 SWAT operative, currently acting as a phantom in this frozen purgatory, tasked with monitoring a cartel supply route that snaked through the valley below, but the blizzard had severed his comms and buried the world in snow, leaving him trapped with only his thoughts and the haunting echoes of past failures. He checked his Sig Sauer P226 for the 10th time that hour, the mechanical click a comforting tether to his reality, his calloused fingers moving with the unconscious grace of a pianist playing a familiar sonata. He was lean and wiry, built for endurance rather than show, with dark hair cropped close in a military fade that was now overgrown after weeks in the field, and a layer of coarse stubble shadowed a jawline that was perpetually set in tension. He was a man who preferred the company of shadows to people, finding the chaotic unpredictability of human emotion far more dangerous than the calculated risks of a firefight. The cabin groaned under the wind's assault, the temperature dropping rapidly as the thermal insulation of the walls failed against the sub-zero onslaught, forcing Ethan to huddle closer to the cast-iron stove that was fighting a losing battle against the chill. Suddenly, beneath the cacophony of the gale, a sound snagged his attention, not the roar of nature, but the distinct, rhythmic keen of suffering. It was a sound that bypassed his tactical training and struck a primal chord, a whimper that sounded impossibly fragile in the violent night. Ethan didn't hesitate. The lethargy of the weight vanished, replaced by the fluid lethality of a predator as he kicked the door open into the white void. The cold hit him like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in his nose and stinging his exposed cheeks, but he pushed through the waist-deep drifts, his tactical flashlight cutting a weak yellow cone through the swirling snow until it landed on a patch of disturbed earth near the tree line where a small rock slide had occurred. There, pinned beneath a slab of granite that must have weighed 200 pounds, lay a German shepherd, her coat a dark sable that blended with the shadows, her amber eyes wide with shock but devoid of the feral panic one might expect from a wild animal. She was large, clearly of working lineage, with a broad chest and a muzzle grayed slightly not by age, but perhaps by stress, and even in her trapped state she radiated a stoic dignity. She snarled weakly as he approached, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground, her ears flattened against a skull designed for impact, but Ethan saw the agony behind the aggression. Her back leg was crushed, trapped tight against the frozen mud by the unyielding stone. "Easy," he murmured, his voice raspy from disuse, holstering his weapon and dropping to his knees in the snow, effectively discarding his role as a hunter to become a savior. He jammed his gloved hands under the jagged edge of the rock, gritting his teeth as he leveraged every ounce of his core strength, his muscles screaming against the cold and the dead weight of the earth. The veins in his neck bulged, his boots slipping on the ice, until with a guttural roar, he shifted the slab just enough for the dog to drag her mangled limb free with a sharp, heartbreaking yelp. He didn't wait for her to bite. He scooped the 60-pound animal into his arms, ignoring the blood soaking into his expensive tactical parka, and stumbled back toward the sanctuary of the cabin, kicking the door shut against the storm. Inside, by the dying light of the wood stove, he laid her on his sleeping bag, the heat of the room slowly thawing the ice on his lashes as he stripped off his gloves to inspect the damage. The dog watched him, her breathing shallow and ragged, and as he brushed back the wet fur around her head to check for shock, the firelight caught the inside of her ear. There, inked clearly against the pale skin, was a sequence of numbers, a military tattoo. Ethan froze, his thumb tracing the mark. She wasn't a stray. She was a soldier, a K-9 operator lost behind enemy lines, just like him. The antiseptic sting of iodine filled the small, freezing room as Ethan finished securing the splint, fashioned from a broken chair leg and strips of heavy gauze, around the shepherd's crushed limb. He had decided to call her Alpha, a temporary designation for a creature that commanded the room with a gravity far beyond her species. But as he sat back to wipe the sweat from his forehead, expecting the exhausted animal to collapse into the oblivion of shock, Alpha did the impossible. With a low, guttural whine that sounded more like a demand than a plea, she scrambled upright, her claws scrabbling frantically against the wooden floorboards. The splint knocked hollowly against the timber as she ignored the jagged agony that must have been shooting up her flank, her amber eyes locking onto Ethan's with an intensity that burned through the gloom. She didn't retreat to the warmth of the stove. Instead, she lunged for the door, clamping her powerful jaws around the cuff of his tactical pants and tugging with a desperate, frantic strength that nearly pulled him off balance. "Stand down, Alpha," Ethan commanded, his voice firm, trying to push her back onto the sleeping bag, but she snarled, a sharp, warning snap that didn't aim to harm but to correct. She released him only to limp aggressively to the door, barking once, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the howling wind outside, before looking back at him, her body trembling not from cold, but from a terrifying urgency. Ethan stared at her, his tactical mind racing to decipher the behavior. This wasn't the disorientation of pain or the flight response of a trapped animal. It was a directive. She was a K-9, a living, breathing asset trained to communicate, and she was telling him that the mission wasn't over. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't been running away when the rock slide hit her. She had been guarding something. Ethan cursed under his breath, grabbing his heavy parka and zipping it up over his Kevlar vest, checking the load in his weapon one last time before pulling on his thermal gloves. "Show me," he said, opening the door to the white hell once again. Alpha didn't hesitate. She plunged into the snow, moving on 3 legs with a heartbreaking, fluid determination, plowing a furrow through the drifts with her chest. Ethan followed close behind, using his flashlight to cut a beam through the suffocating whiteout, shielding his face from the ice needles that whipped sideways in the gale. They didn't go far, perhaps only 200 yards toward the dense tree line that bordered a steep ravine, but in the blizzard, it felt like a mile. Alpha stopped at the base of a massive, overturned root system of a fallen pine, where the snow had drifted high against the dark, exposed earth, forming a natural, albeit precarious, shelter. She began to dig, whining high and thin, her good front paw tearing at the snow she had likely packed there herself hours ago. Ethan dropped beside her, pushing her gently aside as he saw what she was uncovering. Hidden deep within the recess of the roots, shielded from the wind by the angle of the earth and a bed of pine boughs, was a small, hollowed-out den. Inside, huddled together in a desperate pile of fur and shivering misery, were 3 puppies. They were impossibly small, likely no more than 10 days old, their eyes just beginning to unseal, mere specks of life against the encroaching death of the storm. The first one Ethan scooped up was a male, a solid black lump of coal with a tiny speck of white on his chest, shivering so violently his teeth would have chattered if he had them. He was the largest, likely the protector trying to shield his siblings. The second was a female, a sable copy of her mother, but frail and limp, her breathing shallow and fast as hypothermia began to shut down her tiny system. The third, buried deepest in the pine needles, was the runt, a scrappy little thing with mismatched paws and a coat that looked like gray dust. He let out a sharp, defiant squeak as Ethan's warm glove touched him. Alpha nosed them frantically, licking the ice from their faces, checking their vitals with a mother's frantic precision. Ethan realized then that she had used her own body to shield this entrance, taking the brunt of the elements until she went to find help or food and got caught in the slide. She had traded her safety for theirs. "I've got them," Ethan yelled over the wind, unzipping his tactical jacket. He didn't have a bag, so he created a kangaroo pouch against his chest, stuffing the 3 freezing bodies inside his thermal layers right against the heat of his skin. The shock of their cold fur against his chest made him gasp, but he zipped the jacket up to his chin, leaving only a small opening for air. "Move out, Alpha," he ordered, turning back toward the cabin. The return trip was a blur of adrenaline and suffering, with Alpha limping heavily now, her reserves spent, leaning against Ethan's leg for support with every step. When they finally crashed back through the cabin door, sealing the storm out, Ethan sank to the floor near the stove, his chest heaving. He carefully extracted the puppies, placing them on the wool blanket he had warmed by the fire. Alpha collapsed beside them, instantly curling her body around the shivering trio, her eyes closing as she let out a long, shuddering sigh of absolute exhaustion. Ethan watched them, the hardened soldier in him cracking just a fraction as he saw the fierce, undeniable victory in the dog's posture. The storm raged on, but inside, against all odds, life had held the line. The adrenaline that had fueled the rescue mission began to recede, leaving behind a hollow ache in Ethan's muscles and a silence in the cabin that was quickly broken not by the wind, but by the high-pitched, rhythmic mewling of starvation. The 3 puppies, now thawed and drying against the wool blanket, began to root blindly against Alpha's belly, their tiny mouths searching frantically for sustenance that simply wasn't there. Alpha lay on her side, her eyes glazed with pain and the heavy fog of exhaustion, licking the top of the black male's head with a desperate, apologetic rhythm. But her body, ravaged by trauma, dehydration, and the brutal shock of the cold, had shut down non-essential functions. She had no milk to give. The realization hit Ethan as he watched the puppy's cries turn from demanding squeaks to distressed screams, their tiny ribs heaving as they fought for a meal that their mother couldn't provide. Ethan stood over them, his silhouette looming large in the flickering firelight, feeling a surge of helplessness that was alien to a man trained to control every variable of a battlefield. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused, instruments designed for precision violence, for pulling triggers and dismantling explosives, not for nurturing life so fragile it could be crushed by a careless thought. "Tactical problem," he muttered to himself, forcing his mind to shift gears from combatant to caregiver, treating the hunger in the room as a logistical failure that required an immediate solution. He turned away from the heartbreaking scene and dropped his heavy rucksack onto the floor, the thud echoing in the small space as he began to strip it of its contents with methodical urgency. He bypassed the ammunition and the demolition charges, digging straight for the MREs, meals ready to eat, that were the lifeline of any long-range reconnaissance patrol. He ripped open a brown plastic pouch, the sound sharp and artificial in the rustic cabin, and poured out the contents. A main meal of beef stew that was too rich and salty, a packet of jalapeno cheese spread, and a vacuum-sealed brick of crackers. It wasn't puppy formula, but it was calories. He grabbed his metal canteen cup and filled it with snow, setting it on the cast-iron stove to melt, watching the white powder turn to slush and then to steaming water. Ethan took the crackers, dry and tasteless but packed with carbohydrates, and crushed them into a fine powder using the butt of his combat knife, grinding them until they resembled flour. He added a packet of sugar and a pinch of salt from the accessory kit, creating a crude, high-calorie base. When the water was warm, not boiling, he checked it against his wrist like he had seen mothers do in movies. He mixed it into the powder, stirring it with his finger until it formed a thick, warm gruel. It was an ugly, beige paste, but to the starving creatures on the floor, it smelled like salvation. He returned to the blanket, kneeling beside the distressed family. Alpha lifted her head, her nostrils flaring as she scented the food, but she didn't try to take it. She nudged the black puppy toward Ethan, a gesture of absolute trust that made his chest tighten. "All right, Marines. Chow time," Ethan whispered, his voice dropping to a soft rumble. He scooped a small amount of the mush onto his index finger and offered it to the black male first. The puppy clamped onto his finger instantly, sucking greedily, the rough sensation of the tiny tongue startling Ethan. He fed them one by one, a slow, messy process that required an infinite amount of patience. The female was slower to eat, too weak to suckle properly, so Ethan had to pry her tiny jaws open and drip the mixture onto her tongue, stroking her throat to encourage her to swallow until she finally got the hang of it. Then there was the runt, the gray scrap of fur who fought for his share with a ferocity that belied his size, covering Ethan's hand in sticky paste and slobber. For an hour, the war outside ceased to exist. There was no cartel, no blizzard, no mission. There was only the rhythmic sound of feeding and the warmth of the fire. When the puppies were finally full, their bellies round and tight, they collapsed into a heap of sleeping fur, their breathing slowing to a contented rhythm. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, feeling a strange, heavy exhaustion that was different from combat fatigue. It was the weight of responsibility. He looked up to find Alpha watching him. Her head was resting on her paws, her amber eyes clear and unblinking, fixed on his face. In that look there was no barrier of species. It was the look one soldier gives another after a firefight, a silent acknowledgement of a debt that can never be fully repaid. She didn't wag her tail. She didn't need to. She simply held his gaze, her breathing syncing with his. Two broken warriors huddled together in the dark, guarding the only innocent things left in their frozen world. Ethan reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before settling on her neck, burying his fingers in her thick ruff. "We hold the line," he whispered to her, a promise made in the dark. "You rest, Alpha. I've got the watch." The storm broke on the morning of the third day. The violence of the wind replaced by a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against the frosted panes of the cabin windows like a physical weight. Outside, the world had been scrubbed clean, the Bitterroot wilderness transformed into a blinding expanse of pristine white under a sky of piercing, merciless blue. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was shifting from survival to something far darker. Ethan stood by the window, squinting against the glare, watching the steam rise from his mug of black coffee. Behind him, by the dying embers of the stove, Alpha was attempting to stand, her movements stiff and awkward as she tested her splinted leg. She was healing, the swelling having gone down significantly thanks to the cold compresses and Ethan's constant attention, but she was still a shadow of the warrior she had been, hobbling on 3 legs with a gait that would make combat impossible. The puppies were a pile of contented sighs in the corner, blissfully unaware that the truce with nature was ending, but Alpha knew. Her ears were swiveled forward, tracking a sound that Ethan hadn't yet registered. Then, the silence was shattered not by a natural force, but by the harsh, static-laced chirp of the encrypted satellite radio sitting on the dusty mantel, a piece of technology that had been a dead brick for 48 hours. Ethan moved instantly, crossing the room in 2 long strides to snatch the handset, his demeanor shifting from caretaker back to operator in a heartbeat. "Vance, secure," he rasped, his voice rough. The voice that crackled back was distorted by distance but unmistakable in its urgency. It was Major Sterling, his handler at command, a man whose voice sounded like gravel grinding in a cement mixer, usually devoid of emotion but now tight with suppressed panic. "Vance, listen closely. We have a situation report upgrade, catastrophic level. The blizzard masked their movement, but satellite thermal just picked up a heat signature on the North Ridge Trail. The cartel isn't just moving small arms. Intelligence confirms they are transporting a stolen tactical warhead, a suitcase nuke intended for a buyer in Seattle. They are moving to the extraction point at the old airstrip." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, his grip on the radio tightening until the plastic creaked. "ETA?" he asked, his eyes flicking to the trail visible through the window, the trail that ran barely 50 yards from the cabin's front porch. "They will pass your position in approximately 60 minutes, Sterling replied, the transmission hissing. "The weather has grounded the birds at Fairchild. We are scrambling a ground QRF, but the roads are gone, Vance. They are at least 2 hours out. You are the only asset in the kill box. You have to hold them. Delay them, disable the transport, do whatever you have to do, but do not let that payload cross the ridge." "Copy. Vance out." Ethan dropped the handset, the silence rushing back in, but now it was charged with impending violence. 1 hour. He was one man with a rifle, a sidearm, and limited ammunition against a heavily armed convoy protecting a nuclear device. He looked down at Alpha. She was standing now, watching him with intense amber eyes, sensing the shift in his pheromones, the scent of adrenaline and fear. If a firefight broke out here, the cabin would be turned into Swiss cheese. Bullets didn't distinguish between a Tier 1 operator and a nursing mother. He couldn't fight effectively if he was worried about them. He needed a bunker. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the heavy iron ring set into the floorboards near the kitchenette, the root cellar. It was an old-fashioned cold storage dug deep into the earth, lined with stone and thick timber, originally designed to keep perishables from freezing in winter and spoiling in summer. It was damp, dark, and smelled of earth, but it was bulletproof. "Alpha, on me," Ethan commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. He hauled the heavy trapdoor open, revealing a set of steep wooden steps descending into the gloom. He quickly grabbed the blanket with the sleeping puppies, bundling them up carefully, and descended into the cellar. It was cramped, barely 4 feet high, lined with empty shelves that once held jars of preserves. He created a nest in the corner, farthest from the trapdoor, laying the puppies down. They squeaked in protest at the cooler air, but quickly settled. Ethan climbed back up. Alpha was waiting at the edge, looking down into the hole, then back at him. She whined low in her throat, a sound of torn loyalty. Her instinct was to fight beside him, to guard his flank, but her heart was in that hole. "I can't cover you out here, girl," Ethan whispered, kneeling to look her in the eye, his hands framing her face. "You have a new mission. Guard the package, silent watch." He pointed down. Alpha hesitated, her body trembling, torn between the soldier and the mother. Then, with a final lick to his chin, she turned and awkwardly navigated the steps, three-legged hopping down into the darkness until she curled around her brood. Ethan took one last look at them, the only pure things in a world about to burn, and lowered the heavy wooden trapdoor. He threw the iron bolt, locking them in, sealing them away from the light, and effectively burying his heart underground. When he stood up, the softness was gone from his face. He checked his magazines, racked the slide of his rifle, and stepped out onto the porch to wait for the war. The hour of waiting bled away, replaced by the frantic, calculated violence of preparation as Ethan turned the pristine snow around the cabin into a gauntlet of death. He moved with the economy of a man who had long ago accepted his own mortality, his hands working nimbly despite the biting cold to string tripwires made of high-tensile fishing line across the narrow choke points of the trail. He buried his last 2 demolition charges at the base of a massive, leaning ponderosa pine that loomed over the driveway like a jagged spear, covering the disturbed snow with fresh powder until the trap was invisible. By the time the low rumble of heavy diesel engines vibrated through the soles of his boots, vibrating against the frozen earth, Ethan was positioned behind the thick stack of firewood on the porch, his rifle resting on a stable log, his breathing slow and shallow. The convoy emerged from the tree line like a funeral procession of steel. Two armored black SUVs flanking a heavy transport truck, their tires wrapped in chains that chewed through the ice. As the lead vehicle crossed the shadow of the pine, Ethan didn't hesitate. He squeezed the detonator. The explosion was a deafening crack that shattered the mountain silence, snapping the tree's trunk like a dry twig and sending tons of timber crashing down onto the hood of the lead SUV, crushing the engine block and halting the column in a screech of metal and hissing steam. "Welcome to hell," Ethan whispered, sighting down the barrel. The response was immediate and professional, a testament to the caliber of the enemy. Doors flew open and mercenaries poured out, moving with fluid, practiced aggression. They were not standard cartel thugs. These were private military contractors, clad in expensive white winter camouflage that made them look like ghosts against the snow, armed with suppressed carbines and high-end optics. Leading the assault was a man who moved differently from the rest, a towering figure Ethan clocked as the Vanguard commander. He was a giant, easily 6'5", his face obscured by a ballistic mask painted with a jagged white jawbone, his movements directing the flow of fire with terrifying efficiency. Ethan engaged, his rifle barking in controlled bursts, dropping two tangos who tried to flank left, but the volume of return fire was overwhelming. Bullets chewed into the log walls of the cabin, sending splinters flying like shrapnel, forcing Ethan to stay low. He was holding them, but the math was against him. He shifted position to get a line of sight on the truck, but as he popped up, a searing sledgehammer blow spun him around. A round had found the gap in his cover, tearing through the soft tissue of his left shoulder, just missing the bone but severing the deltoid muscle. The pain was blinding, a white-hot lance that made his vision swim, and his left arm went dead, dangling uselessly at his side. Ethan grunted, dropping back behind the wood pile, his blood bright and steaming on the snow. He checked his magazine. Empty. He fumbled for his last reload with one hand, his fingers slick with blood and clumsy with cold. He didn't hear the crunch of boots on the snow behind him over the ringing in his ears. A mercenary, a specialist in close-quarters battle with a sawed-off shotgun and eyes like chips of flint visible through his balaclava, had circled around the blind side of the cabin. He crested the porch railing silently, his weapon raising toward the back of Ethan's head. Ethan sensed the shadow, the displacement of air, but his body was too slow, too broken to react in time. He turned, seeing the black bore of the shotgun, and knew it was over. But the shot never came. Instead, an explosion of wood and glass erupted from the side of the cabin's foundation. Alpha, the three-legged warrior, had thrown herself through the rotting frame of the cellar's ground-level ventilation window. She hit the snow with a stumble but recovered instantly, ignoring the agony of her splinted leg, and launched herself into the air. She was a blur of sable fury, a missile of teeth and rage. She slammed into the mercenary's chest, her jaws locking onto his wrist with the crushing force of a hydraulic press. The man screamed, the shotgun discharging wildly into the sky as he fell backward off the porch, flailing under the assault of the crippled wolf. Alpha didn't let go. She thrashed her head, tearing at the limb, buying Ethan the second he needed. Clarity returned. Ethan slammed the magazine home, racked the slide against his belt, and leaned over the railing. 2 shots, double tap, center mass. The mercenary went still. "Alpha, release!" Ethan roared. She let go instantly, panting, blood on her muzzle, not hers, and looked up at him. She couldn't stand on her back leg anymore, collapsing into the snow, but her eyes burned with a defiant life. She had broken out of safety to save him. She had held the line. The silence that followed the double tap was heavier than the storm had ever been, a ringing void where the world used to be. Ethan slumped against the porch railing, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of gray static as the adrenaline crashed, leaving behind only the searing agony of his shoulder and the bone-deep cold of blood loss. Beside him, Alpha, Sasha, though he didn't know her true name yet, lay panting in the crimson-stained snow, her flank heaving with every breath, her eyes fixed on him with a devotion that transcended the pain of her shattered leg. The vanguard commander lay dead in the yard, his white mask cracked, and the remaining mercenaries were scattering, their cohesion broken by the inexplicable failure of their assault. Then, the sky tore open. It wasn't the wind this time, but the rhythmic, thumping heartbeat of a UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter cresting the ridge, its downdraft kicking up a blinding whirlwind of diamond dust. Ropes deployed from the skids like black snakes, and men in tactical gray slid down with practiced fluidity, their boots hitting the ground running. It was the QRF, the cavalry arriving on wings of steel. Leading them was Lieutenant Commander Thorne, a man built like an Abrams tank with a buzz cut so sharp it could cut glass and a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite. He moved with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train, barking orders that cut through the rotor wash. "Clear left, secure the package, medic on the principal." Ethan felt hands grabbing him, strong and professional, checking his vitals, applying a tourniquet to his arm with brutal efficiency, but he shoved them away weakly with his good hand. "The dog," he rasped, his voice a wet gurgle. "Secure the dog." Thorne knelt beside him, his eyes scanning the carnage, then landing on the shepherd. He didn't see a stray. He saw a fellow operator down. "We got her, Vance. We got you both." As the medic worked on Ethan, another operator checked Alpha, reading the tattoo inside her ear. "Commander," the operator shouted over the engine whine. "Tattoo confirms. This is K9734. Sasha. Missing in action from Operation Tundra 6 weeks ago. We found her." Ethan looked at the dog, Sasha. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a lost hero coming home. They were loaded onto the bird together, Ethan refusing to let go of the ruff of her neck even as the morphine dragged him under. The flight back was a blur of lights and noise, but the connection remained unbroken. Months bled into seasons. The snow melted from the Bitterroot, replaced by the vibrant green of alpine summer, and the nightmares of the cabin were replaced by the scent of freshly cut grass and pine. Ethan stood on the podium at Accolade ceremony in D.C., his dress blues sharp and pressed, the Navy Cross heavy on his chest, but his eyes kept drifting to the side of the stage. He accepted the medal not for the cartel he stopped, but for the lives he saved. His request for transfer had been processed in record time. He was no longer a shadow hunting ghosts in the dark. He was the new lead instructor for the specialized K-9 search and rescue unit based out of Montana. But the real reward wasn't the medal on his chest or the patch on his shoulder. It was the scene waiting for him back at the new property he had bought with his back pay, a sprawling ranch at the foot of the mountains, far enough from the world to be peaceful, close enough to be home. Ethan sat on the wide wooden porch, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of violet and gold. In the tall grass of the paddock, a chaotic game of tag was unfolding. The 3 puppies, now 6-month-old balls of boundless energy, were chasing a frisbee with clumsy, joyful abandon. The black male, now named Shadow, was fast and strong. The sable female, Luna, was agile and sharp, and the runt, Scout, was the loudest, barking orders at his siblings. And watching them, her gait possessing a rolling, rhythmic grace despite the slight limp that was the only souvenir of her war, was Sasha. Her leg had been saved by the best surgeons the military could provide, reinforced with a titanium plate that made her tougher than before. She trotted over to the porch, her tongue lolling out in a happy grin, and rested her head on Ethan's knee. He reached down, his fingers tracing the scar behind her ear, the same place he had touched that first night in the dark. They were no longer broken things hiding in a hole. They were a family, forged in ice and fire, standing in the light. Ethan took a sip of coffee, looked at his pack, and for the first time in a decade he didn't check the perimeter. He was home. Ethan and Sasha's journey teaches us a powerful lesson about what it means to truly survive in this world. Sometimes, in the darkest winters of our lives, the miracles we pray for do not come with lightning and thunder, but in the quiet loyalty of a friend who refuses to leave our side, or the strength we find to protect those weaker than ourselves. Just as God guided a broken soldier to a trapped dog in the middle of a blizzard, He places people and purpose in our paths when we least expect it, reminding us that redemption is always possible and that we are never truly fighting alone. This story is a testament that even when we feel buried by the weight of the world, faith and love can dig us out. If this story of sacrifice, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a warrior and his dog touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might be walking through their own storm right now, as it might be the light they need to keep going. And if you want to hear more stories about the resilience of the human spirit and the animals that save us, please subscribe to our channel and join our family. Let us pray together. Dear God, we ask that you watch over everyone listening to this story. When the winds of life howl and the cold sets in, grant them the strength of a survivor and the loyalty of a true friend. Give them the courage to stand their ground against the darkness and the faith to believe that the dawn is always coming. Protect their families, heal their wounds, and remind them that no matter how deep the snow, your love is a shelter that will never fail. If you believe that God can turn your battles into victory and your storms into peace, please type Amen in the comments below.